I would like to introduce, actually one by one, our panelists. Angelika Nollert, I would like to maybe start with you. Angelika Nollert is the director of the Neue Sammlung, the design museum at the Pinakothek der Moderne in Munich. She studied art history, archaeology, and German at the Universities of Würzburg and Münster. After working on the sculpture project in Münster in 1997, she was the curator of Porticus in Frankfurt am Main and was in charge of the Documenta 11 project in 2001. And she headed the fine arts department of the Siemens art program in Munich before she moved to Nuremberg as the director of the Neues Museum, State Museum of Art and Design in 2007, and then became that director of the, I'm sure there's many stages in between, but what's important also, I think this is where you want to connect also, or in the museum, they run in Munich now a program called Reflex Bauhaus, 40 objects, 5 conversations, and I think you're going to tell us a little bit more about the connections between Munich and the Bauhaus history.
So thank you so very much for the kind introduction, and also say, yeah, I really enjoyed being here, and I think we heard a lot of perspectives already. And of course, when I start now to say a little bit about our exhibition, Reflex Bauhaus, then I think there are some items which might be interest further on for talking, and also maybe it's already a reflection of things I said yesterday. So we started to have in the 100-year anniversary year also to have an exhibition, and we thought we have good reasons, and a couple of reasons to do so. We are now sitting in Dessau, and you know all these wonderful 3 Bauhaus museums have large collections, but we thought, of course, we will not compare, and we would never think of being like to compare with this or compete with this. The idea is we have a much smaller collection of Bauhaus objects. Of course we have, but still we said we can be very proud because we have a maybe unique position in the history of the collection in Munich. And this comes from, our museum was founded in the year 25, and that was the same years, of course you know better, that was the relocation of the year 1925, when the relocation of the Bauhaus was from Weimar to Dessau. The first director of our museum, die Neue Sammlung, was Günther Freiherr von Pechmann, and he immediately started in the year 25 to buy Bauhaus objects. So he started to buy Bauhaus objects by ceramics by Otto Lindig, and in 26 he traveled to Dessau with a check of the ministry, of the Bavarian ministry, and he could acquire directly from the Bauhaus Dessau a couple of objects. And among these objects are 2 wonderful textiles by Annie Albers from 25, directly bought here in Dessau. We have also you can say the label still existing, and these are wonderful pieces. And there are other ones by Gunther Stölzel, of course, but these wall hangings are exceptional by Annie Albers. Then we have a lot of metalworks by Wagenfeld, Tümpel, and so on. And we do have also other things like toys, Alma Buscher, early pieces, and Ludwig Hirschfeld-Mark, and so on. So there are a lot of these items in our first inventory list. There are handwritten these acquisitions, and it's stated that they are coming directly here from Dessau. So this is a very nice starting point for our collection, but you can also say, and I think this is relevant for this idea, is what does it mean, a foundation of a museum in these years? And as we heard and as we know, there are a lot of reform movements. they were going on, and they lead not only to the foundation of the Bauhaus or the development, but they also lead to some museums foundations. And the Neue Sammlung is one of this. And this is from, and there are a lot of links already. For example, there was one school, the so-called Deutsches school in Munich, which was founded in the beginning of the 20th century. And Deutsches school was regarded as an experimental studio and a college for students. And Wolfgang von Deutsches, who was the founder, he was also a friend of Walter Gropius, for example. And Walter Gropius, before founding the Bauhaus in Weimar, he visited in the early 10th years, he visited a lot Munich, and he visited, of course, Wolfgang von Deutsches, and they had a lot of talks. Walter Gropius also studied in Munich. Maybe there also the relation to Munich came from, and he studied at the Technical University in Munich. Another link is that the Bauhaus publishing house was also situated alongside Weimar in the first years, but then was incorporated by the Albert Langen Verlag in Munich. So there were a lot of links in between, and I could go further on, but I think we have only short times. And to tell you now the idea, we thought we are, in a way, from the same reform spirit founded, then also other developments led to the foundations of the Bauhaus in Weimar. And we wanted to show all these early items. And what we did is we thought, what is thinking further on Bauhaus? What does it mean for nowadays, for our public? Is this only these icons or the idea of the modern, the idea of the minimalistic ideas? And so we invited a visual artist, Thilo Schulz from Berlin, to make a contemporary and from the perspective of another discipline on our design objects. And what he created was a high table. So, and he put on 40 objects, that's the title, 40 objects, 5 conversations. And we invited 5 artists, or you can say 1 artist, 1 visual artist, 1 designer, 1 architect, 1 composer, and 1 writer to have to be influenced from one of the objects, to make a dialogue and create new work out of it. And so this relatively young generation of these different artists, composer, writers, and so on, and they dealt with our pieces and created new work. And to give you one example, we have the chess play by Joseph Hartwig, and we invited an Indian composer, Japanese composer, Junio Okawa, and he did the composition out of the idea of the movements of the chess game. And so you can hear the music when you, of course, we have an edition, a new edition of the chess game. And when a person comes to our exhibition and wanted to play chess, and the visitors are doing this, then they can hear a composition which is interactive, developed by their own moves on the chess game. So this is one idea how to react or to interact with the public. And so, of course, all these ideas, what does it mean? The idea of the modern, the idea maybe of what is new, what is innovative in these days of the Bauhaus, but also what does it mean for today's, for a design museum, is relevant for us, and we really like to discuss this. And to give you another example, which was happening before the anniversary of the 100 years, was that we invited Hela Jongerius, and of course she was absolutely fascinated by the fabrics of the Bauhaus, people like Gunther Stölzel or Annie Albers, and also she dealt with thoughts of our collection. So what we are doing is we invite, in general, designers or artists to think about our collection and maybe also to reenact specific objects. But in this very specific case, we try to find version how to really find contemporary presentation formats and also how to create new work, even in design, in this case by Isaac Bostan, who invented a new furniture and of course influenced by Marcel Breuer, but of course in a very contemporary way. And to say one more example which shows you the close link in between Munich and the Bauhaus was, for example, and I wanted to tell it because here it's in Dessau, you know, there was Ludwig Rothe. He was one of the state conservator here in Anhalt, Dessau, and he was the advisor for Fritz Hesse, and he did the former mayor here, and they did the negotiations for bringing the Bauhaus to Dessau. And Ludwig Rothe, who was also a friend of Annie Albers, he asked Marcel Breuer to make his furniture, and so he bought some desks and he bought the bedroom furniture, and parts of all these furniture went into our collection directly from his wife. And maybe there's another link here to the talks yesterday. He became the first director of the Germanische Nationalmuseum in Nuremberg, and so he moved to the south of Germany and further on after retiring also into the near of Munich. And so our objects, and that maybe is a unique position, the 40 objects we are showing are all Bauhaus objects done by Bauhaus masters during the Bauhaus time. We had this yesterday in another talk. And on the other hand, we purchased it, or the acquisitions were directly made from these Bauhaus masters. And that maybe is a very unique position, or the most of our acquisitions are like that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, what's fascinating is what we discussed yesterday. The provenance seems to be very short, so it's so direct that it's also interesting, but to see them now as a collection. But you really work from the collection and like trying to invite to new positions, right, with artists. So, which kind of is probably something that. That links the previous presentations. And I would like to move on, because later I would like to cross more or get more into a discussion between all of you to Hetty Berens, who's a conservator at the Nieuwe Instituut in Rotterdam, an institution that holds, as I heard, an amazing collection of architecture drawings and models, but also engages with new architectural collections and formats in which architects work. And you're also the curator of the Sonnefeld House, an important modern building. And maybe you tell us a little bit more.
Okay, so I work at the Nieuwe Institute. It's right opposite of the Boijmans, where Minke was telling about. And it only exists for 6 years. It was the Architecture Institute, and then it merged together with 2 other institutes for design and e-culture. So many of us, I think, have heard of the Netherlands Architecture Institute, and that has, and it still has, the biggest architecture archive in the world. We collect, I think, maybe from 120 years, Dutch architects in a broad sense, not typical designers, not only landscape, but mostly architect in broad sense. And for the past 3 years, I worked on the Bauhaus project, just to make visible what we have in the collection, because that's not always sure. We had several interns that studied, to start with, the 4 Bauhaus students that we have in the collection, Bauhaus architecture students that studied there for a shorter or longer period. First on the brothers van der Linde, and afterwards Roxanne Brands, who's in the room, studied the 4 architecture students. And when we started this project, I thought, well, there must be articles, and she couldn't find them, and so I thought, well, this must be a beginner's mistake. But there was no article about these Dutch architecture students. So now we are starting up. She's writing about it, and I hope this will be brought outside in the world in a publication. The Nieuwe Institute, however, so that's parallel, did not do a Bauhaus exhibition. I mean, we facilitated, of course, Minke and her team to explore in the archive and to be generous with loans, but we started the Neuhaus project and used the Bauhaus, had the starting point of the Bauhaus in the 1990s as a starting point for a project that is talking about the context for designers today. What is new knowledge for designers today? What is the context they are responding on, reflecting on? So they, I think, put in the sort of core, the climate crisis, and they were talking about new knowledge from plants and animals. So we did a huge project on the Neuhaus, and this is within the whole institute, because you have to keep in mind that we have several hubs of research in the institute. I'm not sure whether that comes from the change from architecture to new institute, but there is this Marina Otero, she's head of the research department, a very international. We have the Jabakema Study Center, strictly connected to the Technical University in Delft. And then we have the research at the Heritage Department. So those are 3 research hubs in the Institute, and the collection is working, collaborating on all these research projects. And I think the fascinating the aspect of this, not only for me personally as a conservator and architecture historian, is that you can see not only scientific research or artistic research, and I think we've seen beautiful examples of your work in Israel of that, and then you can see how interesting the collection can be in this wide variety of research projects. For example, we did a huge project on squatting. It was called Architecture of Appropriation. There is also now an English book about this project. I acquired the archive of an architect. It's not a star architect, it's the opposite. I mean, if you look at his architecture, no one will think, should you collect this? But he worked a lot with squatters in Amsterdam in the 70s and 80s. He interviewed them. He took pictures in these squatters' buildings and wrote on these pictures because I think he was convinced that when he left the building, he could not remember what was where. And so he had to transform these buildings for the city government or a housing corporation into housing complexes. And the squatters mostly could still live in there then afterwards. So we collected this archive, but other colleagues from the research department went to squatted buildings and made floor plans with the squatters. And we collected those floor plans and pictures and documents of these squatters. So we created our own archive. So this is a sort of a pilot in the approach we're dealing with. And of course, we still acquire huge archives. For example, the latest one is MVRDV, that you might know from the Markthal in Rotterdam, very international architecture firm that now also builds the collection building for the Bauhaus Museum right opposite of our own building. And they have a lot of digital material. They did a lot of digital research projects. So we're not only acquiring their building drawings, but also that digital material. And of course, we're in the forefront of lots of developments in how to store that material. What we do with the collection as a heritage department, the next year will be a huge project on the copy. The copy is usually, a blueprint of an architecture is usually sort of devaluated. It is a sort of second range in your collection. You always think, well, should we keep copies? Is it as value as the original ones? How should you interpret it? But what was the role of the copy in the architecture practice when it started in the 19th century? So we will focus on that in the next few years, because we got a huge sum of money from the national government, 11 million euros, to restore and digitize, but also to activate, to do innovative projects with the archive, and that is being recognized, and I think that's why we got that money.
Thank you very much, Hetty.
You're welcome.
I think our next speaker, Katja Leiskau, she will actually continue, or like we actually have now 2 institutions that are concerned with the collection of architecture, drawings and materials, but also stand at the interface between kind of collecting as a kind of an collection of the past, but also to create new research material and actually to build the archive by building and producing new documents. So Katja Leiskau is the head of the archive of the architecture at the German Architecture Museum in Frankfurt am Main. She studied the history of art and Russian language and literature at the Philipps University in Marburg, where she also wrote her doctoral dissertation, which I think is important, on the architecture of public archive buildings in Germany between 1871 and 1945. And she was involved in recent years in various projects of digitization of archival documents in the Architecture Museum at the TU in Berlin, at the Staatlichen Kunstsammlung in Dresden, and the Deutsche Photothek, I think more recently before taking up the post in Frankfurt.
Thank you so much, Ines, for this kind invitation. Yeah, now a contrast program. As you might know, the German Architecture Museum, Deutsches Architekturmuseum, opened in June 1984 with the exhibition Revision of the Modern, and for example, later followed by Postmodernism Revisited. Our museum is itself is housed in an emblem of postmodernism. It's a mansion built around the year of 1900 on the banks of the River Main, and it had been transformed to an architectural museum by Oswald Matthias Ungers in a strict and ambitious way. The above-mentioned critical debates about contemporary architecture would not have been thinkable without the references to the testimonies of classical modernity. And of course, we do have Bauhaus-related materials in our archive. A part of the estate of Hannes Meyer and Lena Meyer-Bergner, the literary one, the legacy of Marsdam, and also some single drawings or series, for example, by Theo von Doesburg or Forkosh Molnar. Not directly Bauhaus related, but comparable in goals and methods and results is the urban development of Frankfurt from 1925 to 1932 by Ernst May, Martin Elsässer, and Ludwig Landmann, the new Frankfurt, das neue Frankfurt. One of my aims for the next years is to digitize and publish our collection of plans online, and also to update and enlarge our existing digital model collection. So far.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Katja. I think we could start a little crossover between us, and because we have heard such high caliber themed presentation, I would pass on to the floor very soon. But before we go there, maybe I could ask you all for maybe a short statement on something which we maybe have learned yesterday when we looked very much into kind of the methods of researching the provenience of the objects in our museums and collections. I think Hila has maybe shown us an extreme version of like how to research the provenance and to create actually new projects, but they became kind of a new document, right, in itself. So it probably goes now beyond the limits of what the museum is doing or the archive is doing, right? It has its also maybe in continuation to the collectors we had here last night, who also, and I think maybe we didn't ask them about the budget they give themselves, but either you need a budget or you need a kind of a very clear definition on where are your limits and when you research. And if it goes into provenance, like I think you get into this fever to research deeper and deeper and to make more and more connections to things. Also, we had this wonderful question yesterday asking actually museums to present not only the material qualities of the artwork, but also to present the provenance of these things. So this gets a little bit out of the framework of what's maybe possible in catalogs, what's possible in your own institutions, and how you really can be responsible to the function or definition of your institutions. Maybe, Fernando, we haven't heard you for a while.
Well, thank you. Let me take your question in a slightly different way. Because I think my answer is yes. We need to do that, and we do that. It's okay. So we put, if we can, and in our collection, in the catalogs, we have normally the provenance of 80% of the objects, and we are beginning the process to include them in all the information. But I think this is a technical issue in a way. We should do that, and provenance could be a kind of obsession in a way at the same time. So let me refer provenance to transfer in a way, which I think is much more interesting, because it is the traveling of idea, the traveling of objects, it is the handing over of objects. And I think in those terms of transfers, I should relate that with the centenary of Bauhaus, because there is always a danger about making kind of commodity of celebrated objects or institutions, and even a certain kind of provincial tendency, specialization tendency. And I think it's much more fascinating, perhaps because I come from far away, and because that have the kind of mythical relationship with Bauhaus, that to understand all these as a much more complex network. And let me give a couple of examples in my presentation that probably is related with what Hila was telling. In the case of Sheila Hicks, she had Annie Albers at home. So it's very mysterious why she needed to go to Latin America to discover textiles. And even Albers, knowing this interest of Sheila Hicks in textiles, introduced her to his wife. But in a way, it didn't work. And Sheila is telling, well, I didn't know much more about Annie Albers, which perhaps is not completely true. But the thing is that you have something at home, you need to go far away and discover it again, and then reflect again. And in the case of Albers going to Chile, I show one slide that we had already begun a course, an abstract preliminary course, 5 or 6 years before Albers came to Chile. But the problem was that it was a local course, and we needed someone from abroad to tell us that was true and that was filmed, and to codify in a way that. So it's much more, and it's polemical sometimes, because that man that created that course, Alberto Cruz, sort of created another school, the Valparaiso school, a very experimental kind of school. And he once told me, Sergio Larraín, who invited Alves, instead of thinking, invited a professor. So there is this combination of the local and the, what you don't know, something is abroad, something can't. And in that case, all this Bauhaus phenomenon is an international one, it's about networks, it's about an enormous amount of conversation. And this is also connected with provenance, and I find it fascinating.
Well, this is also this year, no? This is this fascination with the 100 years where all archives and museums kind of look what they have and how they can relate to this year. Also, maybe as a side note, I have in my book, I'm lucky to have an article by Daniel Taljesnik about Tibor Weiner, who actually takes, the ideas, the pedagogy of Hannes Meyer to Chile. He goes in 1939, shortly after the earthquake, goes there and actually is working on several projects there, and then works actually at the University of Chile.
The other university.
The other one, exactly. That's what I was checking earlier again, whether it could be the same. But interesting that Chile is also, of course, a place we have to check. But let's go back to the provenance. I mean, this is your theme, or now the transfer was combined to it, because you also have the side term artistic research. And you oppose it to the other one, which I would like to take, but you don't have to. The academic.
Yes. Well, I think the artistic research is mainly on speculations. And sometimes the artistic research or the artistic practice starts where the information is arriving to a dead end, because we never know everything. And it's, but if you dedicate yourself to the research, then the speculation gets, I think, a lot of deepness. And actually, we collaborated with two academic advisors in this project, Joachim Teresib and Ines Zonder, and they wrote a text to this artistic research book, and they wrote a non-academic text that seems like an academic text, but it's actually made up, and they enjoyed so much, the ability to write or to invent the papers that they would have wanted to find but never found. And I think in many ways, I won't be surprised that in somewhere there is exactly these same letters that they wrote, because they are so deeply involved in this kind of research. But this is just something about, the academic research title. And I want to say another thing relating to collection, because also you said that, well, now it's very popular to invite all kinds of artists and designers to active the collection, and I think that activation is different than presentation. It's not just to activate an object, is not just to show it. It's to create maybe another layer that is not just the date of where it was exhibited, but to see it through a perspective of a different person, and then the questions become different. And for me, the goal is really to. And sometimes, it's, a museum is supposed to keep, and to guard on the collection. And sometimes activating something, it could be a bit dangerous, depending on the artist. And for me, and I know it's controversial in this room, but I would prefer an object broken through someone trying to use it than being safely guarded and kept, in the collection where no one sees it. And I think it's always like a conflict. But I think that also part of our responsibility is to activate these elements in order to give them, a contemporary life. And yes.
Pass on the history of the object. Yeah, we don't need to go in roses.
Well, I'd like to give a follow-up on this, because with the Sonnefeld House, our biggest object in the collection, we did as well the more scientific research as art projects, as artistic research projects. And we are lucky that The art school in Rotterdam has a master, and the master is called Miart, and they do sort of spatial projects. So I often offer the Sonneveld House as a research object for their study. So we had some beautiful examples of students that really dove into the material, interviewed heirs of the Sonneveld, rewrote text by ourselves. They found new information. For example, on the maids in the house. Maids always stay a sort of object that younger people are interested in because they don't longer assist in our daily life. So I found that interesting. We asked several international artists like Santiago Borja from Mexico or Petra Blaise, international working. And I think they generated a fascinating view on the house. I mean, when it was the Architecture Institute, there was this sort of clear story, architectural historian, about light, air and space of the Sonneveld House. But that story sort of stops after a while. So with sort of reloading the house with new interpretations, I really think we went forward. But the interesting thing was the grandson of the Sonnevelds could not identify himself anymore when we were transforming the house. So although we have a very good relationship with him, and we now have again, and we need his stories because I think oral history is very important also in this story of the Sonneveld House. We got sort of mixed up in agreements because what is the Sonneveld House? And I think he still had that idea of the house museum as a period room instead of a house that could be reactivated and reused again. And I must say that since I'm in the board of the Iconic House organization, I visit many house museums, and you see that there is a special group of house museums that is interested in inviting artists to work with and really come up with very beautiful projects.
Sorry, and thank you very much. And also to add to your thoughts, I think there was really a shift in the attitude of museums, and maybe they are not realized everywhere and also not always in our place, of course. But I think the shift is that you do not have the clear or the traditional distinction in between the disciplines, and I think that also fascinates us very much by the Bauhaus, this idea of course, old idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk, but still it's not really the attitude of a museum nowadays still, and to maybe to intermingle disciplines or to do not say that or the old hierarchy of disciplines, they are still sometimes existing in the head of a lot of people, but I think that's the shift museums were done or are in the middle of doing or will do. And the other shift maybe is that you do not have the idea of the icons anymore, so the hierarchy of the objects anymore. And that means also that a little pattern is maybe from the similar value as the really icon of a masterpiece. And I think this changed also in the idea of the visitors, that they are more and more interested, and maybe also museums communicate this, that it's more the idea of the narrative, what is behind. And of course, it's also fashion word, the narrative. Everybody's doing a narrative to an object, but still, it shows you a shift in the attitude of museums, I would say, and in the attitude of also of research. And I think it's more and more about making, or maybe to communicate a phenomenon during a certain time and to find out what is the important facts which are still important. And even if you have historical objects, what is the importance still for nowadays? And I think this is more and more the idea of communicating and educating, and also not only like the visitor as a passive person, but also to bring in ideas also from the field of maybe only curious people, or people who are not in the field of research, but that you say it's also important what your ideas are about these objects. And I think this is the attitude changes, and we are in the middle of a change, and I think you see it also here in the museum very well.
I think it's very interesting she brings this up, because yesterday when Marianne Brands came on and on and on the screen, I sort of had the opposite view. It's sort of bring up the icons and bring her back on stage and again and again. And if you look at the archives of the 4 Bauhaus students who had an architecture practice afterwards, it's much more down to earth. But this sort of revaluation has not started yet. So I hope that with the publication of Roxana Brands, we can start this. This is different material. We do not collect objects, so we do not have Marianne Brandt in a collection. We are telling new stories, more on another level, and I hope that we will see more of this.
You mentioned also this. You just said it that in the Sonnefeld house, the original inhabitant didn't recognize himself anymore in it, which is, I think, it's an old story. Adolf Loos, who said, "I don't want to be want to have any photographs of my interiors, because surely the inhabitants would not recognize themselves in the photographs or the architecture." So there's already in the very kind of this looking back at the artifact, or at the original through another medium. It's kind of, it's familiarized, but we have amazing photographs from that very same photographer of the work of that architecture, right? So that architecture might be also lost if we don't move on and looking back at those works. And I think this is what I think it really takes us to today, where really another dimension has been opened to. Definitely also for that myth of the Bauhaus in Tel Aviv, which I think that narrative not quite breaks it, because we try to find the traces back to Germany, but at least gives a little bit of a very dark shadow to that history that seems so simple if we celebrate it this year, right?
I just want to add on this point, because if you think, while these schools are being closed here, a white city resurrected in Israel through German goods. So it's about connection between things, like a deep connection, and it's even mystical, because there's something. We started this research because the White City Center is being funded by the Ministry of Bildung, if I pronounce it correctly, for 10 years on, and the German government is paying the content of the White City, and the Tel Aviv municipality gives the salaries and the building. So it is still a connection today that sends us back to look where it actually started. And then, so everything is still totally like Ariadne thread, yes.
Yeah, although I have because we worked in parallel on that very same topic, and we looked more closely actually at how many Bauhäuslers actually went from Germany to Palestine, and it was actually surprisingly few. At the end, only 3 actually worked and built in Tel Aviv, and so that to just also try to break that myth. And I think we need to also reconsider that also the building products as a much larger network of really thinking of like a global immigration and arrival to that city, which had numerous influences also from architecture schools to which Bauhauslers went, but also others studied, because also Dov Kami was actually trained in Ghent, and so we just have to reopen our imagination, which has been glued up a bit in 100 years. Now, we have some questions from the floor. Yeah. Mr. Sherwood. Oh, share. I don't see much, so you have to really raise your hands. We are really in bright light.
Thank you very much for this wonderful session and for bringing Hila Cohen-Schneiderman to Dessau. I don't know if she's on your list of Bauhäuslers who went to Palestine, but I guess I could start with a question to Hila. Are you familiar with the name Hans Moller? Hans Moller was married to Annie Wotitz, and while Hans Moller was a Zionist, Annie Wotitz was not. She went with him to Palestine, knowing she was going to die there. Another name is
to Kiryat Atta, actually.
I'm sorry?
Of all places, to Kiryat Atta they went.
Okay. Is that near Haifa?
It's in the north.
Yeah. But he moved his factory, I don't know if it was a weaving factory in what is now Czechoslovakia, probably not too far from Terezin, from Theresienstadt, probably under this program, which I never knew about, where the Nazis moving goods and people to Palestine.
It was his cousin who was already there. His cousin went and he followed him later on. So the cousin went already in the early 30s. So not.
What was the cousin's name, if I may ask?
Don't know. I wrote an article about him, and I could.
Yeah, I'd be interested in. I mean, this is for me. It seems like this is a huge area for development and a very direct connection between the Bauhaus and Israel.
Adolf Loos, who built the Hans Moller house in Vienna.
Exactly. Yeah. That was another. I mean, this is just a whole new area, I think, for many people. And I don't know where it takes others, but the other connection that links Munich, Annie actually spent most of her time, when she was supposed to be at the Bauhaus, she was actually in Munich, and corresponding with Bruno Adler, I think, who played a key role also in the moving of the printing from Weimar to the printer in Munich, or the Verleger in Munich. But I just want to say this is fascinating to me, and thank you very much for coming here. And I look forward to talking to you more about Annie Wotitz and the Zionists from the Bauhaus.
I just want to say that this is an unspoken story, and that's why, and like Ines said, it's a thread of all kinds of interest. And when we try to find the different interest in the space in Palestine, so there was very obvious the British interest, because they also imported goods from part of the mandatory, and there was a German interest, and there was the Jewish interest. And we were also very curious about the Palestinian, especially they had all kinds of factories and this kind of goods influence on them. And we didn't find anything written about it. So we went to speak with Walid Karkabi, which he's Palestinian, and he's the head of the conservation department in Haifa. And he investigated in the 30s, and he never heard on these agreements. So, and we tried to speak with 3 more Palestinian historians who also didn't know anything about it. And I'm saying again, my motive is not academic, so I don't have all the information. So we did this, very artistic research, although we sat in archives, and this knowledge can serve all kinds of scholars. So there's much more to understand, and it's endless. It's files on files on files that no one even opened. And I must say that the last sentence, that there was a newspaper review on our exhibition, and a day after I received a phone call from the granddaughter of the Strauss family. Strauss family is one of the strongest economical forces in Israel. And she told me, I'm so happy that you're doing something about it, because 2 years ago I went to the Zionist archive. I found 2 files with more than 200 papers that proves that all our company was built through the transfer agreements, and no one was really interested to hear about it. So,
good. I have to enter this because I think one needs to say, because I think also this agreement and this arrival, we have to also see what it does to already existing material transport routes that existed historically in the whole of the Levant, where you could travel from Cairo to Istanbul and go over the mountains with all sorts of materials. And so we have a completely new story that obviously it's kind of a very critical and yeah, very careful to read history. But please, another 1 or 2 questions. Regina, maybe? Sorry, I don't see one.
Yeah, thank you very much for this interesting panel. I have a question to Fernando. Thank you for your fascinating talk. And I was just wondering, it's a brief question, how do you exhibit this Ariadne's thread, starting with this object you got from Sheila Hicks? And is there an attempt actually to unfold these complex geographies and networks in an exhibition? I think scholarly text is one, but to translate it into a curatorial project, this is the challenge. Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's not an exhibition at the moment. It's part of the collection. I discovered it and I found it fascinating, and perhaps we can do something with it. And of course, because of this big exhibition of Sheila Hicks now in another museum, it took a kind of relevance at the moment because we received that many, many years ago. And you need sometimes to interpret that to really find out which are the importance of an object, and need to be connected to lots of events really to understand, because if not, it's a very kind of modest object. And so that could be a task for the future, I hope. And but anyway, we had other kind of activations and interpretations of this kind with our collection. Is a sort of practice beginning. Sometimes it's very controversial. Sometimes it has to do with conservation, as you mentioned. So mixing up. For instance, we planned for the future days to make a kind of performance of a contemporary artist in front of a classical Chilean painting. And so you need to take the painting from the collection, it's an important painting, and then exhibit it in the hall, and then have this kind of performance where the artist is kind of imitating. So we do those kind of things, but not exactly in the case of Sheila Hicks' work. Thank you.
Hello to everybody. Thank you for your approaches. I think they have opened as much questions. I will just narrow down into one that I found very interesting, because we are currently doing a design research master. So for us, archive material, as you mentioned, academic research and art research go hand to hand, but also have these dialectical interceptions into anthropology or ethnography work in some sort. So my question would be to any of the panelists, like how archives now have a commitment to meet up in the midpoint of mediation and education into communicate not only the objects, but what it entitles, what it carries upon, and how permeable can an archive be, not only for researchers, but as you mentioned as well, people curious about their history, not only a material history, but intangible cultural history.
Well, I can talk about 2 projects that we did. Just to focus more on, for example, inclusiveness, diversity. In that, because we have a sort of agency department, which is more focused on the international relationship of the New Institute, we show material that is not shown in a more regular basis. If we talk about the colonies, for example, you can always show these beautiful white cinemas that were built in our colony, Indonesia, in the 1920s, 30s. But the last time when I did a project like that, I selected a picture from a half-naked woman from that area that was never described in our collection. And we didn't have a sort of framework to describe this. So in our architecture archive, it was a sort of isolated item. But working with students, with teachers, in a project like this, you develop to frame it, to describe it, to use new words. So we have these evenings in the archive, in the study center, in which we show the material and then we invite speakers from outside to reflect on it and come up with projects. So our collection will be part in discussions from today. So if you talk about how do you open up your own archive to the audience, new audiences, this at the moment is our approach. That
yep. Perhaps I can add a couple of words on that. I think the archive problem is very central, not only because museum, and it is our case again, sometimes have wonderful archives, but they are not so focused on that because the tradition was that the important pieces were the art pieces. So archives was something functional was there, but now they have been discovered by researchers, and so we need to really organize that and make it a kind of important part, an important element of the museum, because museum is also a producer of knowledge for the society. And there is a fantastic history of the building, of the collection, of the acquisition, of the administration. Everything is there and is fascinating. But at the same time, archives now is part of the artistic experience also. So there are many artists working in archives as a kind of new expression. So then you find another connections, and we have now something which is called the Media Biennale, and they work with that idea of archives as part of the art expression, registering and trying about register. So all that connection between art and archive is now central and very important, I think.
Yes, just
okay. But then just one last question, just to the audience.
Just to say that part of the exhibition, we found, part of the research, we found a file, and that's the exact name of it in the Zionist archive, called The Employment and Dismissal of Dr. Dov Knopf, Controller of Avara, Trust and Transfer Office. And the theater person, Nir Shaulov, just took this file and took all kinds of sentences and turned it into an operetta. So he recomposed it, and it was totally based on, you know, the archival file. So exactly as been said here, I think it's so rich just to give artists also to work with the physical text and elements and turn them, or to reveal another layer, because sometimes, you know, when you read all these papers, it's boring. Yeah, and then you find something that is pure gold. When I read the title of this file, I said, okay, this is already a play. You just need to give it to someone who will turn it into a practical play.
Okay, we have another last question. Oh, sorry.
Yes, I would like to ask to all of you, but especially to Hila and Fernando, about how do you present an object in a museum context, taking into account that the museum as an idea is a European institution, was born in Europe, for example, like in countries like Chile or in, geographically speaking, in Latin America. How do you present prehistorical or pre-Columbian objects in a European context, how do you communicate, for example, these connections between modern ideas or modern objects with pre-Hispanic objects into an European context? Sorry, taking into account this post-colonial...
I can begin with us. We are lucky because we don't have those kind of objects in our collection. So. But anyway, we leave that for the Pre-Columbian Museum, which is fantastic. It's very good. But we begin only with colonial art in our collection, and that means something, I think. So when Sergio Larraín, that I mentioned, began, so he was a wonderful collector from his youth, but he collected all kinds of arts, let's say Romanesque art and modern art. And in a moment, he discovered pre-Columbian art. And he sold everything and concentrated on that. So he discovered that and then founded the Museum of Pre-Columbian Art in Santiago, which I think is a great museum. So the first issue was exactly letting people know about a kind of chapter, because it's not the same in Peru, probably also in Colombia, in other places, because we didn't have this kind of culture. The kind of local art we have was different kind of people, so we don't have such a settled civilization before the arrival of Spaniards. So that was important for the culture of the city to let the people know about that chapter in our continental history. But then, of course, the way of presenting that, all the curatorial aspects is a big chapter of that. I think that for the first time, this museum organized this exhibition by Sheila Hicks. So making that connection between contemporary art and pre-Columbian art. And I think it has been wonderful, very successful, but even problematic for some people in the museum. They say it's not our thing, we are concerned with other things, this is contemporary art, this is not. So it is something problematic, but we need to work on that, I think, to make all this material really alive.
Also, I wanted to give one example of collection started in 25, but we have also some, of course, we have items which dated backwards up to the beginning of the 19th century, but under the idea of the modern. So I wanted also to give one example that in the early 30s already, there was one exhibition at our museum which was called Die ewige Form, which in a way I would translate like forms which are timeless, maybe, and last forever. And there were really archaeological objects exhibited, old Egyptian objects exhibited from other museums of Munich in this case, and they were confronted with the contemporary objects in the fields of ceramic, in the fields of metalwork, and in the field of glass, mainly, but also wood was exhibited and so on. And there were no labels on. So the visitor didn't really know, is this 1,000 years old or is this from yesterday? And that was, I found, an interesting way of bringing things together. And I wanted to say an early example, not made out of the collection, but the idea of what forms, what shapes, what material is used, and can it be compared, or how can we develop a context where it comes from.
Okay, thank you so much also for bringing up that very important aspect of the kind of the colonial collections, and I think it would take another panel to bring also the Bauhaus maybe into a colonial context, right? I mean, this and Chile would have been perfect, I think, to start with. So also the idea of restitution of. So no, this was my final. Yes, lunch is calling, I heard. And yes, I would like to thank you all for this wonderful panel, for this discussion, and to the audience for being part of it. So, thank you.